Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, and we are live streaming. I'm just going to change my stream on my Facebook page to public so people can comment if it comes up.
And then am I tagged in that? I know you're live already.
We are live right now.
Okay, so does that stream to me? Okay.
Yep, it's going to be on Facebook. It's on Facebook, 2 different platforms. And then there's a few privacy issues that I need to deal with when it comes to the chat. So as people comment on Facebook, it actually comes up in my little chat plugin right to my left of my screen here. So I have my laptop set up and
I'm going to share it right now and be
perfect.
Like, I'm live with Shawn Soole.
It's a little bit of inception when you start like watching this, then watching the live stream behind, then
a weird delay.
yeah, there's delay, but the good thing is that people can interact with us, and I'll take time as we start talking to sort of stop and ask questions. And I've got a couple of questions that were emailed and texted to me this morning, which is great. And so it's going to be good. It's going to be a good day. It's going to be a good day. So a little preface. I think we talked about it yesterday on the phone. I've tried to, obviously I am very hospitality business orientated, as you said with my podcast, but I do believe for my demographic, I got young bartenders as well as operators, and I've been trying to give advice to both ends in regards to, I believe the COVID-19 was a blessing and a curse. The blessing I see is that we can all take stock and talk about our vulnerabilities, talk about the issues we have in the industry, because I think in the industry we have this sort of veiled sort of perception of what people outside looking in see. Like we can, as operators and as service people, we can have the most horrible day possible, and then we walk in through the door and jump behind that bar or jump on the floor, and we're supposed to have a big smile on our face and go, "Hey everybody, how you doing?" And we're supposed to put on this falsity, which I don't think really translates the true vulnerability of our industry in every facet that we have, whether it be living wages, as you talk about labor, everything we're going to talk about today. So I think COVID has sort of been a blessing, because there's a lot of restaurateurs that have finally come out and gone, you know what, you guys all see me in magazines as successful bartender, as a successful chef owner and all this sort of stuff, but I'm scraping by, like literally scraping by. And so I usually like to open the podcast with obviously introducing yourself and sort of telling everybody to give some context, your origin story. I always like the origin story to start, because then it brings context. Like, how did you get in the industry? How did this all happen?
Yeah. So first, for anyone who doesn't know me, I am in downtown Toronto. I live on a very hectic corner right downtown. So I will apologize in advance if you hear sirens or just random screaming, or even just like horses, like police cops, because that's a thing right now. But yeah, so I am generally Toronto born and raised. I was raised in a suburb, and I went to high school and university downtown, and I've never left. Only ever really worked in Toronto. I don't think pop-ups and things count. And I ended up in hospitality somewhat as a fluke. I grew up in a church, so I grew up loving food, and I grew up loving like serving people. In a church, it looks different, but it doesn't look as different as you would expect from a lot of aspects of hospitality. In first year, especially moving out, not having a lot of money as a student, one of the best jobs to get is in a restaurant or some sort of situation like that, because one, the hours work really well, and two, one thing that I liked is you always had a meal. And so that kind of like cut out a bit of your budget that you needed for that day. I originally had thought I'd be more in the kitchen, but kitchens don't generally hire a lot of like younger women and younger Black women. And it's a lot easier to get hired as a hostess. That's why many women in our industry start as hostesses. And so I started as a hostess, and I started especially as an outdoor hostess for one winter on King Street in the theater district, and eventually became a busser and a server, and kind of snowballed from there. I did eventually felt like I really enjoyed, here's one, I really enjoyed hospitality. I really enjoyed the idea that it might actually be a career. Serving might actually be something I wanted. Managing might be something I wanted to. And then growing up with a mom who was a nonprofit accountant, knowing how to aid with an audit, knowing how to do accounting is something that always helped me from even when I was 18, because I always helped with accounting and certain things in a restaurant. And I think we all know that restaurants are notoriously bad at finances. So anyone who can look at an invoice and not have a panic attack, it automatically has worth regardless of who they are. So yeah, flash forward, I guess, a bit. I've managed the majority of my career. A lot of people who are probably more likely to see this would know me more from cocktail and bar scene, which, to be pretty honest, I really only got into in the last 4 years or so, almost accidental as well. I was in the process of speaking to investors with the idea of opening a whiskey-focused bar, and we were in the business plan stages. And part of that bar concept involved having like an importing side business as well. And ideally that importing side businesses would sell to bars. And I knew a lot of people from my time in restaurants or like fun bars or whatever and working. I knew a lot of industry people. I didn't know a lot of cocktail bar focused industry people. And going to them to even see if they were interested in product samples that we had. Cocktail bar scene, especially in Toronto and especially 4 years ago, was very insular. And if I don't know you, I'm not going to talk to you. And it didn't really matter who you knew. It didn't matter that I knew like everyone in all the big restaurants. So I ended up entering competitions and working at Harvard Room and trying to do things to be like, let's just learn more about this side of the industry. And that turned out well. Like I won a few competitions. I met more people. I ended up doing more things. And then that coincided with a time where I was leaning more into doing more community engagement work, be it through events and hospitality initiatives. And it all kind of like coincided with my leaning more into the cocktail side. So now, I mean, no one has a job right now, but the last year I've been freelance and I work with a few organizations. So I'm the bar and beverage curator with Evelyn Chick for Restaurants Canada. I also work with Evelyn on Speed Rock. I'm the director of programming for Toronto Cocktail Week, which is run by St. Joseph's Media, which is a consumer-focused cocktail week in October. I teach with WSET, specifically their spirit certifications, the level 3 of which is newer. So I did the pilots, gave feedback, and have helped with some of the launching of the teaching. And that's actually been something we've been doing a lot now, testing it out online. Basically beta testing the information and the program we already have to see if that can be translatable online given this new environment. But when I don't do that, I do a lot of work still around just how we make this industry just better, like safer, more inclusive, more welcoming, more what we say it is, like how we live that.
So where did the concept of the whiskey bar and the import company, did it just sort of go to the wayside as you sort of focused in on the other stuff that obviously took your attention a little bit more than doing a whiskey bar focus?
Yeah, I mean, it's a concept that like theoretically I would go back to. I mean, everything changes a little bit anyway. That was supposed to be in financial district. What's a financial district right now? If the towers aren't wanting anyone to go back to work until at least November. Sometimes you think back on plans that you were regretful that you never did. And sometimes you're like, thank God I don't have to worry about that right now. But part of the reason was, it wasn't anything actually with the investors at the time. I just was like, maybe this isn't the best place right now and this isn't the best situation. So that was just like a check-in with myself. And I would admit that in the last few years, I've become increasingly jaded about the idea of owning and managing, especially given a lot of power dynamics that go with that. That's not to say that I would never want to own a place, or like I still think I do. I think that's still like a little bartender, server, manager pipe dream that you never really fully let go of. But I also think that me having that concept in my mind that the way in which you become successful is you grind it out then you own a place. Maybe people also grind it out for you. I moved away from that. I also looked at a lot of behaviors I saw in the people who are the most immediately successful, and I realized I didn't want to do that either.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big part of me shifting some of my focus career-wise.
Do you find, because I feel in the industry, and we'll get into freelance, and the initiatives are coming, but like being freelance for the last year, I know as a freelance consultant myself, plus ownership, do you think this is a sort of romanced nature of the industry for a lot of bartenders, servers, managers to be an owner or be a freelance consultant? And then once they get it, they're like, oh, this isn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be, like working for yourself, especially the freelance consultant side thing. Like the last year you've been freelance. What are the pros and cons that you found being a freelance consultant on the East Coast?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the cons are getting paid. The cons are billing, figuring out your pay rate, getting paid on time, business development. So like something that's good for it. And like, I will say, especially in light of like recent conversations everyone's been having, is I was actually going to, I'll post it later, but I was going to make a post before this, is I've been talking to a lot of friends, female friends in the industry, of all shades and shapes and creeds. And I don't actually know what a bar manager gets paid. I know what I've been offered to be paid.
Mm-hmm.
I have often said what I've been offered as payment to like my white male friends, or I've heard what they've been offered in similar positions or from the same people. And mine is always lower. And a lot of the other women's is consistently lower. But one thing that is added to that complexity is just while you can parse the various reasons, structural and otherwise, why that exists, hospitality in general, people in charge of hospitality, even if they started as a dishwasher or busser, are often very not transparent about what we even hold as industry standards,
Mm-hmm.
what we think a certain job with a certain job title requires. And I know that bar manager is a position that changes drastically based on size, location, revenue, inventory managed, staff managed, what have you. Even considering that, we all know that there's people who work at essentially the same places with different names and owners, and their pay rate's so different.
Mm-hmm.
Having a series of jobs and interactions that were relatively disheartening, one thing that I did notice is it was easier for me to get certain pay rates and to be able to have a certain modicum of control when I freelanced. Most of my freelancing has been with larger organizations or media companies or marketing companies. I don't think that is completely insignificant when I also isolate that I think part of the reason why I've had different pay rates or interactions in traditional hospitality is informed by me also being a Black woman. I think in other industries, they're more used to negotiating and giving certain pay rates to people of different identities. A lot of media and marketing, especially in Toronto, just looks different than what hospitality management in Toronto looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Financially, even with the burdens of floating costs and paying staff, realizing that a net 30 is not a net 30 and
Mm-hmm.
a net 30 could be a net 90 or whatever. And sometimes just getting into the perspective, like, I will be happy when I get paid. I will just believe that this money is coming to me. It still made more sense for me. And it also made more sense because my ability to speak to different issues, to even do different initiatives is easier because I don't have to worry about it under the specter of one, a potentially problematic owner or team that I work with, or just worry about what they would say. Like I'm very lucky. I mean, in that we are all like, no one has a job. You can still see that so many people, even knowing that they might not get hired back to where they're going, are afraid of being remotely outspoken because they don't want it to upset their job. You can
Mm-hmm.
see restaurants worried about saying something about their Black community, even if they were so willing in an interview to say that they always play old school hip hop or whatever they might say, because they're still afraid that, like, I guess if they're guests that would find that political. I know that being more outspoken can affect my career, but I also feel like a lot of things have affected my career. And by acknowledging that and not having a direct boss and having a lot of my contracts, because of the way in which they would have sought me out and I would have engaged with them, be on the same page, so that's part of what they're getting, it is freeing for me to have a more holistic career, even if it's not as safe a career as if I just had a job with, I mean, benefit. Like my last job before I had benefits and I was on a pension track and what have you.
So with all the initiatives that you do, I know that you're doing Drink Atlantic on Saturday, is that correct?
So the next 2 Sundays, I'm doing a bar manager boot camp. The bar manager boot camp actually came from this idea at the beginning of COVID, where a lot of my anxiety, not only about myself, but really about people that I knew and what different bartenders were coming to me and saying was, one thing in all this like safe hospitality conversation, people are maybe having now more because they have that anxiety about reopen, but especially 2 months ago when we knew we were definitely closed and we didn't know how long we'd be closed. And people aren't speaking to like a lot of the actual dynamics they dealt with. Like showcasing pictures that you're like, I miss bartending, I miss serving, I miss cooking. A lot of people on, let's say March 5th, before anyone really thought they were going to be locked down in Canada, were not happy. Like a lot of people didn't like their jobs, they didn't like aspects of it, or there are things that they would have actively liked to change and they felt afraid to change it. That is still with being relatively busy, getting paid on time, and all of that fun stuff, having guests. It becomes weird and hard for people to have that conversation. Like, if that was hard now when I got paid regularly, we were relatively busy, everything was there, what is it going to look like when at best, like I think, parts of the country are open now. So people were 2.5 months in to not working, not having a steady income in the way that they're used to. Their guests also, many of them have that same impression. Even if your guests were people who never lost their jobs, they've lost aspects of their movement. And there's a lot of interpersonal dynamics that happen in hospitality that we as a community, myself included, have leaned into that are toxic, that become harder when you have this like servile mentality, when you don't engage with it. And now we have to reopen and probably absorb even more negative energy, like immediately. So that is all to say, we are reopening our industry and nothing will be the same. Like, you're not reopening the same bar or restaurant you had, because when you create a bar or restaurant, you create a concept, and that concept includes the physical design, it includes the amount of staff you think it will serve per person, it includes the capacity, it includes all of that. And like, we are all being mandated to switch it. I feel like there's very few places that had already distanced their tables enough, had low enough staff that were like actually service oriented, that weren't like takeout places. It's actually probably a very good time to be, or for some regions, to be someone with a more takeout model. So what this bar manager boot camp is about is, what are the things that we need to think about and talk about in the reopen. On this Sunday, it will be pre-open. So anything from rehiring to like rethinking safety to like managing, like even just how you rethink your menus, like the things that people would have to touch, your protocols, your like tins. Like, we're going to talk about that. And then the second week, we're going to talk about in open, like when you are open in your bar manager boot camp, ways to rethink this bar manager job. Because let's say just during open, talking to my friends in the States that are a little bit into it, like de-escalation has always been an issue. It's always the thing that has given new and old bartenders alike the most anxiety. How do I cut off somebody? How do you cut off someone who hasn't been able to be in a bar for 3 months, who has been looking forward to it, and it's their last bit of money, and you're still serving this like $18 chartreuse drink? I would definitely recommend that we're not leading into our most esoteric drinks necessarily, depending on what kind of place you have, right in the open. I don't know. People are pouring 5-ounce vodka sodas at home. They might have a hard time readjusting to like to some of those like lighter or those like more nuanced stirs. Though I mean, I don't know your clientele. But yeah, it's about those things. We're going to talk a bit about the practical, but it's going to be a bar manager bootcamp that's really more like everyone's gone through a traumatic time, even before opening your Facebook and seeing like Black Death the last 3 weeks. A pandemic is traumatic, and that's traumatic for your staff. I don't know if you even laid off your staff like well, so there might be a lot of things that need to be managed in that. I don't know if you're hiring back everyone, and if you're aware of their good dynamics, if there were good dynamics. There's a lot to just manage in that in order to open well and to reset your culture, because you can't have the same culture as you had before. And that goes for your guests as well. If your guests are coming in expecting what they had, they're not going to get what they had. So there's going to have to be some sort of conversation that you as a leader will have in your own spaces about navigating expectations, but still being hopeful about it, like still being positive. Like it's a different bar, but it's not a bad bar. It's just different. And it's just what you also have to do.
So going back, like I think I've been in touch with a lot of younger bartenders and servers who have had this sort of interesting mentality of all the way through, like, I'm just going to go back to the same bar. And I was like, why do you think a lot of people haven't taken this opportunity to utilize the training that's been available through WSET and all that sort of stuff to go and get a job that they're happy at? Why do you think that people continue to go back to a place where they've sort of romanced in their head that they'll be like, you know what, that goes on and I'm not really happy about that, but I still want to go back to that same place?
Yeah, I mean, I will admit there's a lot of, I don't know, I know some people definitely have probably not engaged with a lot of the training online. With WSET, like the one in Canada, 1,500 people signing up so early, I was honestly shocked. Like I will admit that I was probably a little bit more doubtful that that was something that would happen. And people have been great. They've been very engaged. But in terms of why people go back, I think there's a lot of things. I think as an industry, we have supplemented aspects of actual equality and thoughtfulness and empathy to our staff with replacing it with this weird family mentality where this is my family. Families have good dynamics. Families have bad dynamics. We work together. Like you just eat it. And there's a lot of eating it, like in our industry. And there's a lot of fear too. People are afraid of being blacklisted. People are afraid of seeming like disloyal. And people are afraid of just not doing the right thing. The hard thing with everyone thinking they're going to go back to their old places is that realistically speaking, they won't be able to, because I don't think most places will be hiring back all their stuff. Just on a numbers game. Some places like here in Toronto, they will be expanding patios in such a crazy way that there will be some places, depending on their clearance, that they might be able to hire back more people. But we still have an industry that has a very lax attitude to what your scheduled hours means versus what your paid hours will be. And that is something that shouldn't give everyone the most confidence that you're going to go back. Even if you are hired back and you have full-time hours. And then it's something we'll talk about with Drink Atlantic is like, perhaps you have to rethink how you schedule because of flippancy, like being flippant towards people's hours will actually mean a lot more now when they will not only get less hours, you have fewer of them, and they will be getting less tips more likely. Like I think very few places will get the same amount of tips than they got before. But yeah, I think it's like people, a lot of the ways that management has smoothed things over in the past is not through tangible ways of showcasing that they're good managers that other industries have done, be it through benefits or supports. We as an industry, and I've even done this, I literally call myself a bar mom, have relied a lot on our soft interpersonal friendship skills and use that to create a false sense of security for a lot of staff. So I'm not saying, if you do think you'll have your position and if you do believe in the place, obviously a safe job is better than no job if it is truly a job that is safe for you. But I think right now with not even knowing, at least here, we don't even know our opening date still for Toronto. So No one even knows if people will be looking for new employees at all, unless it's a brand new project.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone is afraid of, well, what, and we will probably extend our open past the current CERB timeline. We're going to go past 16 weeks. This is the last period for most people if they started in the first period. So knowing that and knowing it's a national program, not a regional program, it's going to be very hard for some people to even try to do that leap. But I do think you're right. Like, some people have worked on themselves or should probably think about classes or next steps, but that also is hard and requires not only a lot of potentially financial energy, but also like mental and emotional energy, which is hard to do during a pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
and then trauma on top of that.
Do you think when it comes to, like you mentioned in the very beginning, about accounting and financials, and it blows my mind that people don't know what their cover count was the night before or their per head spend, and that's like super fundamental stuff. Do you think that it's a mixture of fundamental misunderstanding of like HR practices, like real, true, like in any other industry, real HR practices, mixed with a little bit of that old time toxicity of like, when I was your age, I worked 100 hours a week. I come from that world, and I've tried very, very hard over the last 5 years to try and break that mentality, because I remember I started pushing that mentality onto staff that didn't want that. They wanted to have a work-life balance, and my work-life balance and your work-life balance, because you work enormous hours as well, is very different to that 22-year-old bartender who has just started in the industry, just got a passion for the cocktail scene. All of a sudden they're being asked to work 65 hours a week, sometimes most of the time as a salaried staff member. Do you think introspection, it's a bottom down, and you said about blacklisting and stuff like that, the entry level workers that we have in the industry sort of standing up and saying like, listen, no, but also education from the top down of like, listen, we can't keep doing this. This is not acceptable anymore.
No. I mean, there's a myth that we all tell ourselves, which is that people are like, that it is incredibly common through hard work to go from, without any other funding, just like your grit and your talent, to go from dishwasher to chef, or from barback to like successful owner. It's not common. It relies on a lot of different factors. It's not really a thing. And especially when you look at pay rate, some people do it, but especially in certain markets, it's something that we often use to like essentially punish the staff under us, to make them think that it's their fault why they have less advancement or less supports, than to actually engage with making it better. And the best example to use that with in terms of like our industry versus another industry is like, I mean, I used to use sick days for this, and luckily everyone's going to have to buy into sick days because there's a pandemic. And if you don't buy into giving your staff a sick day, you should go out of business as a restaurant. If you are opening up being like, when I'm sick, I come into work. No, you stay home when you're sick now. Like, that's part of the problem. But our industry is, how many people do you know who have had a bartender who's been loyal and consistently a good worker in terms of like what you need a bartender to be? So like good with regulars, consistently comes in, good with variants, if not necessarily creative, then very consistent, help you with training, been there for a few years. Most owners that I have encountered in our industry do not entertain the idea of doing even like a small token pay increase per hour for long-running employees that have been loyal, that objectively help with their costing. Training new people, like, I know, is expensive. Turnover is expensive. Training is expensive because they just often waste things, right? Like, it's by accident. They make mistakes. They don't know how to sell. They're not comfortable in the space. The guests aren't as comfortable with them. And to have conversations with a lot of owners where you're like, all right, this staff member's been here for 3 years. I know that the bar minimum wage has technically gone up, but that's what you're paying everyone. Mm-hmm. Why don't you every year of employment do which a lot of places do? Like, I worked for the city of Mississauga as a camp counselor when I was 16. And if I went back, I would still have a retroactive pay increase because I was a long-term employee. And if you're like, why don't you increase their pay by 1.5%, which is essentially being like, every year that you are here, I will increase your pay by like 30 cents. Or like, I'm just saying, like, as a gesture. And people will lose it because there's this mentality that labor is the enemy of hospitality, and labor isn't, it's a big cost. It's not the only cost. And it's also a cost that you romanticize and you use to sell why your industry needs to be saved. Like, why don't you, like, I've used this example with people, but I'm like, if you wanted to save thousands of dollars a year, why didn't you get a gas range for your kitchen instead of an electrical range? That would have saved you thousands of dollars a year. Why is now your dishwasher working an extra 2 hours a week where maybe they would have really nicely shut down the dish pit, the enemy of your profit loss, right? Like, maybe you don't need to do linen pickup twice a week when they charge you for delivery twice a week. Maybe you need to do it once a week. That will save you $1,000 a year. But we as an industry have had such a very like toxic view of what labor is and what HR practices are, because it's based from the same people who created a system where they wanted to pay either nothing or like $1 or $2 an hour. So maybe they just didn't have a holistic view of what a professional was. And we're trying to say that we are an industry of professionals without treating each other like professionals, or at least professionals in waiting. Does that make sense?
Yep. Do you think that mentality sort of spreads? And we talked about on the phone the other day about most ownership in Canada, most bar management are white male in their 30s and 40s. Do you think that sort of mentality on labor of pigeonholing people into this sort of role in a restaurant? Like, I know that in BC anyway, a couple of years ago, Cactus Club and Earls and all that sort of stuff got into a huge amount of trouble for not allowing their servers, mainly female, to wear flat shoes. Like, there was a huge tribunal and a big WorkSafe thing. Do you think this sort of spreads that the way that most people look at labor is interchangeable, transferable, like they're just cogs in the machine that like they can just plug out and plug someone else in?
Yeah. A lot of the attitude that even made more sense when it was cheaper and people say more so had to rely on tips. Like when I first started working, I think my pay an hour was like $5 an hour in Ontario, and it's like very quickly gone up as the minimum. But it's not to say that in general our industry is great at treating any worker well, but our industry is in our society, and we are people who often showcase the worst parts of our society. Anyone who's worked in a bar at 1 a.m. on a Saturday knows that. This idea that we are not a microcosm of what's going on, that like say racism or sexism are things that exist outside and maybe a guest brings it in, but we can't have it in our hearts. It's not something that we would act upon. Doesn't make any sense. If you're like, part of the reason why a lot of say like straight white males do well as say a somm is because a lot of the guests that come in will also see them as a position of authority. So they're more likely to engage with them and they're more likely to have certain interactions happen. And then their managers are going to reward that. They're not going to necessarily take into account the fact that every time I've gone up to a table, or oftentimes when I go up to a table, I am not seen as even necessarily their server, much less someone with somm training. They might just assume I'm there to bus. And that's every single interaction. A lot of managers, even the managers who say that they're super empathetic and they try to be intersectional, don't engage with the idea that like, if you and I worked in the same place with the same guests, we will get different interactions. And that interaction will lead to how a lot of these performance ratings will look, that has nothing necessarily to do with the actual effort on either side. If anything, I'll have to work harder to combat that so it doesn't come out in a negative performance review. Because some people don't want to be served by Black people. Some people don't want to be told what to do. It's something I've like by a Black person. It's something I've encountered teaching, where you show up and people don't expect you to be the teacher. But we have a problem in our industry where, because the faces and the voices have so long been a very straight, white, especially Anglo man, often of a middle class to upper middle class background. If that becomes the expectation, and if people don't question why that's the expectation, if they're like, well, if the idea is, well, they're the ones who are the most qualified for the job, and they're not engaging with the idea that maybe they're not the ones that are the most qualified for the job. Maybe they're the ones that have basically been lifting each other up and not engaging with what the overall industry needs. It leads to issues, and that's why places can say that you have to wear heels if you're a woman. And that's why places worry that even now you'll have places that worry that the female staff have to be attractive. It's very hard to go out, at least in Toronto, and be served, when serving was a thing, by someone who is like unattractive in most places. I know it's something that isn't engaged with that much. There is a reason, even if you're not the person who's a training ground, you have to engage with like where people get their first jobs, why they might be hired in those first jobs, why they might get training, and why by the time you're getting your resumes, you now have a very specific pool. If you've decided you're never going to be a training place, you're only going to take people that are already have already had training, have already gone through it. And if you won't engage with why that might relate to other societal issues, that is also why your place might be very white and very straight and very Anglo and very, very what have you.
Do you think it's a bit of both? It's on the establishment side, but it's also this ingrained, I call it bullshit, but this ingrained the customer's always right mentality that so many restaurants sort of like live by, especially franchises, because I do believe that in the micro venues that you train or I work at or stuff like that, in our little tiny ecosystem, we're trying our very best to have inclusivity and diversity and intersectionality and all that sort of stuff. But in the macro, the big franchises, that sort of thing, this ingrained, cut in stone, customers always right mentality, keep the customer happy, that's all that matters, is a massive like customer up issue.
I would maybe see parallels on management, but like I would say the West End, like make the list cool places in Toronto have the whitest staff compared to if you go to the chain restaurants in Toronto, even in financial district. I'm not saying that older, richer white people don't like to be served by a Black person or find it uncomfortable. A lot of them, it's actually very comfortable to be served by a Black person, a Hispanic person, a brown person, or whatever. It's where that service might intersect with that person also having a level of authority and the style of service that would more likely lead to tensions. But a good portion of my career was in higher end places, and it was fine. I dealt with a lot of shit. I've never liked taking dessert orders because between chocolate comments or coffee orders, it's just not, it's not a fun thing, but I think that explanation that it's the chains ignores the idea that the award-winning hipster younger places have, even in the most diverse areas, especially in the areas that they don't like being called gentrifiers, have often very white, often not even from that city, like actual staff. So there's only so much to blame that on, and they could blame it on relying on people already being trained. They could blame that on service style, which is loaded. Service style and having a certain vibe is a loaded thing that we do in our industry. Hiring people that remind you of yourself or the vibe you want to do will create a very bland atmosphere. It's actually good to have very many different people in your space because they're better at de-escalation and they're also better at giving a good time. If everyone, like we used this on the phone yesterday, it's like, if everyone at your sports bar likes football, then what do you do when you have a golf game, right? Like if everyone who you work with has a very small, narrow frame of what their life experience is, like part of what we all say is like being able to have someone come in and riff with them and have these interactions. When you've chosen such a small segment of personality types and life experience to be the face of your place, then you're only really going to appeal to like a small segment of the population. You're not going to appeal to everyone who could come in, especially not in a meaningful way.
So I sent through some questions, and upon reflection, I was like, I was looking at the macro, and I always try and look at training and sort of bringing these sort of things to light in like a boiling frog mentality of like, you throw a frog in the boiling pan, it jumps out, but you chuck it in cold water and bring the heat up. And while a lot of the stuff you teach and you advocate for in your initiatives is very micro specific, which is also amazing, on the macro, how do we, like, and this is a really loaded question, how do we go about making these changes in the industry that you're fighting for, in a way that we can actually do change?
Yeah, I think the first thing that this is hospitality in general. I mean, this is like Canada in general, right? It's like any industry, but in hospitality in Canada, specifically the bar, more cocktail scene, I think what has to happen first is a real conversation about, do people think this is a problem? I would say objectively it's a problem, but people also have to acknowledge it's a problem. There's a lot of conversations even now, and I do see people trying to do the work, like feeling almost blindsided by it, especially like white owner operators, like having staff tell them true stories and being like, what is this? And having a hard time processing it. One, you have to process it. And part of processing it is not deflecting that it must have been this or that, like it's just actually acknowledging that it's a problem, and that it has almost definitely been a problem in your place. And I can openly say that because even if you've had Black staff, female staff, queer staff, they can often do the same things because we are in an industry that is designed to cater to what society wants. So we're catering to like what society wants. And if we also live in that society, we will do certain toxic behaviors because we also have a system that reinforces it through tipping. Tipping also reinforces just like dealing with toxic behaviors. It's why a lot of bartenders will maybe kick out the like indigenous, like street involved guy who walks in immediately, but a drunk white suit will walk in and they'll at least try to get him to buy a Don Julio and tip them before they walk out. Like it's the same thing. If anything, one guy might they'll tolerate way more violence from that person, but we've decided that some things and some people are dangerous and some other people are not. And we embody that. So I think the biggest thing is like acknowledging that there is an issue and that it's an issue that you have actively been a part of, that you have in some way engaged in, even if part of that engagement has just been not necessarily trying to do anything when it was in your spaces. So I think that's the biggest thing. I would say that's the thing that where Canada is right now, there still isn't a lot of acknowledgement of that. There's a lot of deflecting to the States. There's a lot of it's better than it was 10 years ago. To be honest, as a person of color, it's like, it's weird for me to have to answer, do I think it's better than 10 years ago? Like, I don't know the metric on which I'm supposed to rank racism so that we can get to the place where it's really good, right?
Yeah.
Like it creates a false narrative, which is like, is it what we want to be? And also, if it's easier for people to think about it this way, does this embody what we actually say about hospitality? Is this hospitality for everybody? And I think for some people, it's hard for you to think about, am I worse to guests who don't look like me? Then ask yourself, how much do I tolerate from guests that I think are older, whiter, richer? Is that tolerance different? Say if I scale down the age, if I change the race, if I change the clothes, even if I change the place of work. And what we need to get to is like an actual baseline of what we tolerate and how we treat people that is truly equitable, that also understands how other people interact in those spaces. So I think doing that, doing the self-introspection and actually having hard conversations where you are engaging with people that you have worked with, and also just reflecting on what you've done. And I think you are right when you talk about the honestly sheer lack of real HR in our industry. And a lot of human resources departments are really just created to protect, to protect the employer. But there are some things that are so industry standard in every other industry that aren't industry standard in ours, that that actively facilitate abuse. And even like I posted yesterday, I was like, no one does exit interviews. And that came from like a very personal experience that I was navigating. But it's also kind of true, because for me, months or years after, having to dredge up everything, explain it, then recontextualize it when people didn't even think that it was worthwhile. Like they're like, well, it's hospitality, there's high turnover, fuck this person, we didn't get along, let's move on. People give their notice and then they immediately take them off the schedule. Other industries don't do that. It's not actually like legal, but beyond that, what you should be doing is like anytime you cannot retain staff is in some way a failure of the system. Maybe you didn't hire properly, maybe your managers couldn't manage them, maybe whatever it is, it's a failure of what the system, and the system should have been to like create this work environment. Your workers aren't like hospitals, hospitality, but restaurants and bars are not just a conversation between owners and guests, which is what a lot of our food and drink media treats it as. It's not this owner and this guest have an interaction. It doesn't exist without workers. And it doesn't, so if you're always having turnover and you're never taking an exit interview, you're not allowed to act blindsided that the 3 Black people you've hired in the last 10 years might have some words for you right now. Like, you didn't even do the bare minimum to figure out what you could have done better in the next situation and what you did in the past. You didn't even invest. That's not even investing in your own self or your own business. You couldn't even do that. And I think the more that we treat ourselves on par with other industries, the better it'll be for us, especially if we take an anti-oppression and anti-racist approach.
I find it interesting, because last year I've really delved hard into HR with a lot of my consulting gigs, and it's kind of crazy just doing a job description, like a 3-page, this is your duties for bartenders, dishwashers, absolutely everybody, just sign at the bottom saying, these are my duties, this is how much money I'm going to get paid. The amount of pushback I've got from so many clients saying that's not necessary in our industry is mental, absolutely mental. And I'm like, this is going to set the person up for success. And then if they don't do it, they've signed it, they know exactly what they need to do. They know when you chastise them or bring them into an issue they've had, you can go back to it and say, like, look, this is what you got to do. You got to close down the dish pit, or you got to close the bar down properly, or write an inventory list. But it's amazing how many people have pushed back on that mentality.
Consent is a very weird thing that we don't talk about in our industry a lot, because I think we've talked about it. We've started the conversation about talking about consent in terms of especially sexual harassment. We don't talk about it in terms of your job. Part of having a job description is having something that people can consent, that is their responsibilities, that you can go back towards, right? What's about to happen right now for a lot of people who are even in management positions, or people who are like lucky to be hired back, is they're about to have a completely different job than what they had before. And a lot of their bosses are not going to actually say, here's what I want you to do. We can't afford a social media person. So now I'd like you to do that. I know in the past you were a food runner. Now, because we have to record names and numbers for people coming in, I'm going to have you do some hosting duties. They're not having an affirmative conversation that requires an affirmative like reaction, which again, a lot of people will say yes, to be like, this was your job before, this is your job now.
But it's
like,
not an open-ended question.
What they're going to do, and this is like what we're going to talk about on Sunday, is they're going to be like, well, everything's changed. I don't want to do this. Like, obviously it makes sense. You're not being a team member. And not have the conversation, because part of having those conversations also helps everyone figure out what needs to be done. the amount of times people have been pushed to almost like this breaking point, and then they have a conversation with the boss and they create a new position and everything is better. That would just happen, as you say, if we had a job description. Like the amount of times in this industry, I've had people be like, well, we don't pay overtime. Like restaurants don't pay overtime. It's like, that's not in the Labor Act, like where everyone has to pay overtime over 44 hours. Like, oh, except if you're a line cook, then you don't have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Or people don't pay vacation pay, or people don't allow, like, it's just all these things that we've taken for granted as it's just what you have to go with. Like, it's not true. And it also doesn't create that trust in these like work families that we say we need. Like, if you are an owner, you should have a job description. You should say exactly what you're paying. You should say what you expect from it. And then it's easier for you to even write somebody up. Not all bartender jobs are the same. Not all serving jobs are the same. Not all hosting jobs are the same. Not all management jobs are the same. So the fact that we use the same title with no job description, it doesn't even help the person who owns the place.
So we've got some questions coming in. Are you good for time right now? I'm just going to check in.
Yeah.
Okay. This one's from Tish Solomon. What do you think about how the most successful restaurants take up the most expensive real estate in the city and rent from the landlords, driving up the rent and contribute to gentrification as a whole?
Like the place, I guess the placement of the restaurants in and specifically in gentrification,
gentrifying areas and rent and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I understand. I'm not a big fan of gentrification, right? Like, it's like, especially the way that it's looking in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
But my biggest issue with it, especially how it looks in Toronto, is for many of these places that hate being called gentrifiers, they don't interact with their community. They come into the community. They don't hire people who have a connection to the community. They don't go to community meetings. I've been to like City of Toronto zoning meetings. Part of the reason why in this close down, the cities and the provincial governments and the federal governments didn't care about us is we have not been even good at remotely engaging with our communities, even immediately around us. And when we are an industry that many people, they save up money, maybe they get a little bit from their parents, and they immediately just jump on a lease and they don't get it. Like, this is like also just business sense. And it's funny because talking about making our industry more equitable is also talking about like how people go into bad contracts and they put that work onto their staff instead of having a proper business plan. If you're paying like upwards of $150 per square feet in what is overall a low income neighborhood, and then like that, you're not setting yourself up fully for success. And I'm not saying that there's no real right as a human being to have a business, right? Like, you still need to vet your business plan, plot it out, and ideally don't look at labor as like the biggest variable. But in terms of what gentrification looks like in Toronto, I would be lying if I didn't say that I thought like we were in a bubble. I remember what this scene looked like after the last recession, which will not look like this recession. And there has been a lot of over-leveraged places and it wasn't sustainable. And especially wasn't sustainable because you even see now, even when they tried to do takeout or something, they had no connection to their immediate community around them. So moving to a takeout model wasn't sustainable. It used to be that even if you had a lot of these like neighborhood, more expensive restaurants, they had a connection to people who were there. And even with Uber Eats, like some people, that lack of community is palpable. Rents will likely go down after this. They went down after 2008 in Toronto. That will make some things more accessible. I'm not saying people shouldn't have a business. I'm saying that they should really analyze their business plan the way that a retail shop or someone else would analyze their business plan. And a lot of other concepts aren't allowed to say that they would pay their managers what we say we will pay our managers, and rely only on minimum wage and have unrealistic approaches to what inventory would be carried and everything.
So I got a question texted to me today. So what sort of advice would you give to racialized minorities who are neither Indigenous or Black, who have dealt with tremendous racism in hospitality, who are vehemently anti-racist, but are in between managing the rage of past indiscretions versus trying to support their Black and Indigenous partners?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that like I've actually had to it's not an affirmation because it's not particularly positive. For me, is that you're not crazy. Like you're gonna be gaslit a lot, and you'll have conversations with people, and they will ignore you, or they'll act like you don't understand context. And in hospitality, especially when especially if you're front, actually either way, so much of it is still coming from this almost like servant owner mentality. All those dynamics get exacerbated. I think the biggest thing is having abilities to check in with yourself, to do things that are safe for you. My thing that makes me feel less insane is I like teaching and I like learning, and I was always a nerd when it came to hospitality. So my thing has always been not just certifications in terms of the money side, but just like always learning. It was something that when people ignore you, including people who have worked in an industry for 2 minutes, but they are a young white kid that reminds the owner of themselves, so they get promoted. And when they talk over you, me knowing what I know and me knowing the experience I've had has been something that has been very grounding. But that doesn't mean that people will not treat you a certain way. Like, I still get offered less than people with way less experience than I have. I have had series of conversations recently where I've been very chill about things that have happened in the past and basically treated like I'm making it up, or that they're so shocked and I actually have no idea why. Like, and that is just to say it's a struggle right now, and it's hard. And I do believe in not bargaining too much. I think the hardest part of my career was the part of the career where every day I just thought if I tried that much harder the next day, the reason why people didn't listen to me was I didn't word it well. And the reason why people didn't promote me was because I didn't work hard. And you get into this loop where you're not engaging with like, who are these people I'm trying to impress? What is this structure I'm trying to work in? If they are still never listening to me, if they are not engaging with me, and if I don't see them even having anyone who looks remotely like me around them, or even in like the art they take in, the things that they go to, the people in their lives, am I literally just in an abusive relationship? And I think in hospitality, and this goes for everyone, sometimes you have to ask yourself if you've decided that your work relationship is this weird fake family romantic relationship that's abusive. And for a lot of Black and Indigenous people, it is. It doesn't have to be. There's ways around it, but I just think that that's something to be aware of, and like creating space for yourself, having people you can check in with, having people that you can having, if not a mentor that looks like you, then having somebody who, if they are your mentor, they have to listen to you when you explain situations you go through. A lot of times we might have someone who wants to mentor us, but they don't want to listen when you're like, this is why this happened. Mm-hmm. Like, they don't want to listen when one of the things I was so grateful for, and grateful is a weird word, is with George Floyd and with Regis and everything, normally I would be in service and I would go into work the next day, and I would usually have white coworkers and our white managers who I might be upset, and maybe I'd say something, I might not actually. And they'd be like, yeah, that's awful. At best, they'd be like, yeah, that's awful. Like, the state sucks, without even understanding the idea. I think now maybe because everyone's stuck at home, they understand like what that trauma looks like, mm-hmm. what that trauma feels like consistently. And the idea that, I'm not saying you have to call your Black staff and give them the day off right after, but maybe you do a little check-in and you think about the check-in, and maybe you think about like even who you offer the call off for while still giving like the minimum 4 hours, or like you just actually think about that broader stance, because as much as people are like, now is unprecedented, it's not unprecedented. I like remember crying and like not being able to be in service after Philando Castile died, and no one gave a fuck. It just seems crazy to people, or it seems like extreme. It doesn't seem like a constant trauma that's happening. So I only say that about mentors because I've had some people who were mentors but also didn't care about that aspect of your personality.
Mhm.
And it's the same for Black and Indigenous people when you're going to a therapist. If your therapist will not look at it through a racialized lens, then it's the same with your mentors, and to some extent, it's the same with your managers. You need to be able to have a conversation where your managers have even thought about the idea that a not great customer interaction might have been informed by that.
Mhm.
And if your managers have never thought about that with their racialized staff, I mean, one, if you are a manager, like a non-Black manager especially, who has never thought about that when you are dealing with things with your racialized staff, I would actually say, always have that as a question. Was that guest's reaction partly informed by something other than the fact that their food took too long?
Mhm.
And might that and why did they turn around so quickly? Was it just because I'm the manager? Or
Mhm.
maybe it's because they had that reassuring white influence, or whatever you want to think it is. But yeah, I would say be careful about the people around you. Take things to look after yourself. And also just tell yourself that you are not crazy and you are good at your job and that you will continue to develop your job skills. But the acknowledgement of your continual career development will not always look the way that that acknowledgement and that reward should look. And that's not always on you. And don't take it as an indictment of your actual effort.
I'm hoping, I think it's a pipe dream, to be honest with you, with everything that the industry breeds. I think I said at the very beginning, a higher level of transparency and vulnerability from everyone, like staff feeling comfortable to come to owners and managers being honest with staff, and a two-way street. I've said it a couple of times on some forums, and I've been crucified for it, like saying that I'd love for the industry as a whole to go back to a more symbiotic relationship. Like I like triangles, so like 3-sided triangle, each side the same length, with guest, owner, staff, and no one's trying to piss off or shirk the system or screw over anybody else.
Mhm.
I do think it's a massive pipe dream on my part, but I'm hoping for transparency and vulnerability on everybody's part to just have open conversations and feel comfortable having open conversations.
I posted on my Instagram the quote from the 1968 hospitality servers guide.
Mm-hmm.
I got It has random racist stuff in it, but I did get it because it also has great guides on how to do a fish table side. And part of being Black is understanding that you probably weren't going to get a very woke book on service from 1968. But part of what it says is actually, it's basically kind of what you said. So I'm just going to try to find it. I'm sorry. I could probably find the book. Because I posted one page, but I didn't post the other. And where is this from? May 26th. 1 second. The beauty of the internet. Okay. And it says literally, and this is about tipping. And I say this as someone who's made beautiful, crazy tips in their life.
Mm-hmm.
But also acknowledges, especially when we're going to a model already that where everyone will get less tips and volume will be less, not because of what you're doing, but literally just because of laws. So if everyone gets into this mindset that a living wage is more important because you're not going to make $300 a night in tips, and you're not allowed to just volume it out when the government says stay 6 feet away from each other and do 50% capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And those things where we were like, well, I'll make tips and I'll just volume it out and put my head down, we can't do anymore. So we have to rethink our job structures. It does say, as long as tipping is a custom, discussion will go on until a radical change has been made in the economic relationships between the waiter and his employer. And part of the reason why it says that is because the tip does not actually ensure anything, and essentially it basically puts the onus of an employee's wage on the guest, essentially making the guest a pseudo employer without actual responsibilities of care to the staff, while the actual employer with responsibilities of care are like have taken away some of their pay.
And that's from 1968.
It's from 1968.
Wow. Before I let you go, this has been fascinating. I think we could probably talk for another hour for sure. Is there anything you want to close with? I'll plug the Drink Atlantic. This is probably going to post on Friday, so I'll post the Drink Atlantic links and everything in the description and everything. Is there anything you want to close with? Because I'm blown away. I'm spoiled with the podcast because I get an opportunity to talk to people that I may have known for years and years and years and might not know them really in depthly, because we always get caught up in the conference life and you'd have a drink at a conference and that's pretty much the extent of your relationship. When you're friends on social media, that's it. But then you get an opportunity to have a conversation like this and it opens your eyes to so much in any context. Doesn't even matter if it's right now and what we're dealing with right now, but like any context, it really opens the door to the inside of every industry person, which is what I always try and achieve, so that people have this sort of outside perception of the people, like super successful and happy, and they don't have mental health issues or issues like race and sexual harassment and so on and so forth. So what would you like to close with?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've had what's come up in a lot of conversations with friends, with work acquaintances, online, and specifically for the way I see a lot of my loved people in this hospitality discussion go about it, is I made this joke, like it's not, and I think a lot of people probably also made this joke, like there's an aspect of, especially like how a lot of like white older men have discussed this time, and it's like they've decided racism is a thing, and they're like, it's a problem, and I know it's a problem now, and they're like gonna fix it, and it's gonna be fixed tomorrow. They're gonna get in anti-oppression training Saturday, and it's gonna like maybe they'll do a follow-up next month, and then they're good. And that doesn't engage with like really how it's insidious so much about like anti-oppression, like racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever is. Right, like the very basis of our industry, like as I said, like that was from 1968, right? So when you have all these owners who act like something like that is radical, I'm like, no, that's like an old school service textbook. It talks to you about how you hold your napkin. It says that don't hire foreign staff in a cocktail bar because drunk people don't like accents. Like it literally says that as well. I think everyone has to get out of this mentality that we all have, because you usually have it to be successful in hospitality, that once you identify a situation, you put all hands on deck and then it's done. And like anti-racism especially, but like just general change in our hospitality industry is not flipping a switch, and it is not a checklist. It's not that your checklist, it's like we all have made beautiful checklists and we're like, why is nothing getting done? It's like your staff doesn't understand the basis of why those things are on the checklist. Like they might go through the motions, but they're not going to do it properly. It's the same with this. If you're like, I'll hire 3 Black people and I'll bring in this consultant and that's all I have to do, you're not going to do it. Like it's not going to have this grounding change, or it's going to change the second that consultant is gone for a year and maybe those 3 Black people moved on to another career. So I think as long as everyone approaches this as not like a 1-week thing or a 1-month thing, and this just being like the fact that our hospitality industry as we know it is going to just be different. It's going to change, and it's not a 1-week thing. Like even if we stop having to wear masks, even if we don't have a vaccine, we've already seen what a contagion will do to our industry. So it's not going to go back to like, at least not anytime soon, a jammed space and no one caring about capacity other than the man trying to give you a ticket, and like everyone coming into work sick and us joking about giving each other the flu and like all these things. Like that isn't going to be a thing, and it shouldn't be a thing. So when you're talking about whatever it is for your places and where it is and who you have, it is a slow, it can be faster, but it's an incremental change. It is a purposeful change, and it is an active change. And parts of that change will feel really gross and really ugly. But that is what it's going to feel like. And it's not going to be great. And we will all make mistakes, and I make mistakes. And everyone at some point in time has operated from a position that has reinforced white supremacy and or misogyny. And if you can't say that to yourself, and if you can't look at how that would also underpin, like, have you ever hired a male host? You know, like, or do you like, what is the language in your dress code? One thing I did at Restaurants Canada, which I loved, which I asked, when you design your bathrooms, do you have a change? If you have like male and female bathrooms, right? Like, let's just say you're still going to do male and female bathrooms, right? I don't know the design of your place. Do you have a change room? The change table, sorry, like for a baby. And is the change table, and is there one in the men's washroom? Mm-hmm. Because that is a good way to think of like how you've like gendered your business in a way. Like, everyone knows that like many men have children. Many of these owners have children, and many of them have changed their children's diapers. Many of them think of them as themselves as progressive fathers, but they would only put the change table in the women's washroom, which essentially says, I don't think men take care of their children out. And these are men that often take care of their children out, and they'll still do the same thing. So there's a ways in which that you've incorporated a lot of toxic attitudes into what you do without even realizing that that's what you're doing. And if you're not willing to like sit in it and like journal or do whatever you need to do to analyze it, again, exit interviews that are safe, not combative, are great if you have already done them, because you could just be reading them right now instead of trying to desperately DM any person that you think is going to have a story about you. But having that reflection is good. Like, having that reflection is important, and it's going to be slow. And that's my biggest takeaway. And I noticed that was a lot of people. I've had a lot of well-meaning aggression in approaches I've had and offers I've had, and being like, and we're going to do this. And I'm like, we don't have to do anything this week because almost no one is actually open. So doing this task force when nothing's open will not change the culture of your place when you are open and busy. So that's all I have to say.
I want to thank you for your time. Like I said, this was mind-blowing. I'm always lucky enough to sit down with people like yourself and like learn as much as I can. I have my set of skills, but learning more and becoming better. Like I said at the very beginning, post-COVID, everybody should be coming out of this, whether it be establishment, person, whatever, you should be coming out of this as a better human. But thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Christina.
Thank you, Shawn. Appreciate you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.